One of the things that we've discovered in our research is that people leaving the narcotic farm in Lexington who had been involved with the Addicts Anonymous group were facing some difficult choices and challenges. And this is from a 1953 issue of the Key. It says, acceptance in outside groups. One of the perennial items for discussion around here concerns the treatment accorded addicts after they leave narco and approach an outside AA group in the hope of being accepted and thereby continuing to live the AA way of life. This is a real problem because as far as we know, groups made up of addicts to drugs, i.e. drugs other than alcohol, only exist in New York with Narcotics Anonymous, in Chicago with Drug Addicts Anonymous, and as just a side note, this was started by, Drug Addicts Anonymous in Chicago was started by people who had been in Lexington and had attended Addicts Anonymous. And in Los Angeles with HFD groups in AA, and HFD stands for Habit Forming Drugs Group. Therefore, an addict who does not happen to reside in one of these areas, if he is going to attend meetings, must attend meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous groups. And the treatment given the addict by outside groups ranges all the way from happy acceptance, the usual thing, to utter rejection by a few groups. And they also talk about some of the dilemma that they experience about what to do when they leave. They said, do we leave here and hide our addiction, not tell the AA groups that we're addicts, but then risk our recovery because we're not being honest? Or do we say, practice honesty and say, yes, I'm an addict and I'd like to come to your Alcoholics Anonymous group, but risk being told that they're not welcome? Well, there's a lot of tension within Alcoholics Anonymous groups as addicts began to go to meetings, and it created a range of responses among Alcoholics Anonymous members. In the Key, we see some feedback from a guy named Whitey. Whitey lived in Las Vegas, and he says that the AA program in Las Vegas, the group that meets there, that all manner and kinds of people are made welcome, the thieves, common crooked gamblers, but no dope addicts. So they kind of put dope addicts lower on the list. There was a publication out of San Antonio from their central committee called the Nightcap, and they had an article about narcotics and goofballs, and they said it's their studied conclusion that there's no place in the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous for the narcotic or barbiturate addict. We see a lot of differences between how addicts and alcoholics are viewed, and if we look at Bill Wilson's communication, he always describes alcoholics and addicts as being more different than similar. And in one of his writings, he says, narcotics as a class disdain us. They think we're gutter snipes. In a communication that he had with a AA member in Los Angeles, he writes, another difficulty you will have is this. Apparently morphine and its derivatives does such terrific things to the honesty department that it is hard to get a sound moral area into which the AA program can be introduced. Dope has made these otherwise fine people so phony that it's hard to make a beginning. So really looking at addicts as being very different than alcoholics. He says, I guess I told you, I've noticed in many alcoholics a marked aversion to dope addicts and vice versa. And while I make no doubt that underlying causes of alcohol and drug addiction are quite identical, it is a fact that the alcoholic feels himself a quite different, even a superior creature. To make the score tie, it is probably true that the average addict looks down on the alcoholic. In fact, I've seen that myself. Alcoholics and addicts are mutually exclusive and snobbish. Now, that's Bill's perspective, but Bill wasn't the only person who viewed alcoholics and addicts as being different.
There's an old story. The alcoholic gets drunk, goes home, and beats his wife. The addict takes a fix, goes home, and his wife beats him.
Interestingly, there's a secretary, Bobby B., who we saw earlier had corresponded with the Addicts Anonymous group. Her letters and writings show a great deal of sympathy to people who are addicted to drugs other than alcohol, and she sees them as being more similar than different. So her writings are very different than Bill's, even though they're in the same office. She says in one of her writings, who are we to criticize others who may have used something else? Underneath it all, are we really so different? Now, there's a woman named Lynne A. who started in early New York, NA in Montreal in 1954. And by 1957, she's writing to Bill, and she's making an argument for a program that is inclusive of all drugs, including alcohol, pointing out that, quote, an alcohol addict is still an addict. And in a follow-up letter, she writes, this is what I was really trying to get across to you, Bill, was this. A, basically the problem is the same. B, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that alcoholism is addiction to alcohol. It is addiction that is the problem, not the chemical or the drug that the person is addicted to.
She kind of nails it.
So this kind of shows this evolving understanding and perspective of addiction and what we'll ultimately see with the first step in Narcotics Anonymous. The habit-forming drugs group that we mentioned that was referenced in the article, The Key, this is started by a woman named Betty T., who's a nurse, and she gets sober on December 11th, 1949, but she was also addicted to narcotics and Benzedrine, and she ended up in the narcotic farm and left there in 1950. She was involved with the Addicts Anonymous group when she was in Lexington, but when she goes back to Los Angeles, she becomes active in Alcoholics Anonymous. She recognizes that there's two issues. There are addicts who need recovery and there's no resources for them. And she also recognizes that there are many members of Alcoholics Anonymous who are still taking sedatives and narcotics and don't recognize the danger associated with that. So to address those two needs, on February 11, 1951, she starts a special closed meeting in her home for AA members who had this dual problem of alcohol and other drug addiction. And we know that she's aware of Danny, and we know that she's aware of Houston, and later we know that she's aware of Jimmy and Cy and people like that. She tells Bill in one of her writings that she's corresponded with Danny in New York, and she can't go along with him. She says, I got my sobriety in AA, and I owe my life to it. I couldn't and wouldn't do anything that was against our principles in any way. So she sees the solution as bringing addicts into Alcoholics Anonymous. Well, this actually, after a period of time, gets a lot of pushback within the Alcoholics Anonymous Fellowship in Los Angeles, and by 1957, there's mounting tensions, and Betty's practice really becomes kind of a lightning rod for these criticisms. Bill becomes critical of Betty, who'd been recommending that drug addicts attend AA meetings. And he says, personally, I'd feel glad that drug addicts seem free to go to open AA meetings, but I doubt it would be wise to encourage them to think that they can actually become Alcoholics Anonymous members. In some spots, we've even had violent opposition to drug addicts attending AA open meetings. As a result of this tension and a lot of, kind of criticism and so forth, Bill says, I need to take a stand on this. And on the February 1958 issue of The Grapevine, he publishes an article called Problems Other Than Alcohol, What Can Be Done About Them? And he concludes in this essay that, quote, we must accept the fact that no non-alcoholic, whatever his affliction, can be converted into an alcoholic AA member. And he really kind of at that point says that AA has a singleness of purpose here that needs to be protected. Boyd, in our research, has come away with some insightful perspectives on how Bill handled this particular issue.
Yeah, I personally think that this was a huge crossroads right here when Bill wrote this, because he basically said, that basically Alcoholics Anonymous can't do anything for anybody else but alcoholics. Now, what is Narcotics Anonymous, the gift that he gave to the world and to Narcotics Anonymous, is that he allowed Narcotics Anonymous to use and adapt his steps and traditions, because, by the way, his copyrighted steps and traditions, because had he said, no, we can't help you, but we don't want you using our steps and traditions, that would have been the crime of the century, folks. But that was the gift that Bill basically gave the world right there, was to let them use. Yeah.